Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm exploring something we all at some point do, but will probably prefer to think or claim that we don't. And that's lying and cheating. Now, it might surprise you to hear that my guest isn't just going to help us to understand how lying and cheating works. He's even established some rules, but also that it isn't always a bad thing. And he's going to do that from a start point that might surprise you. Not the human race, but the animal and natural kingdoms. Because my guest, Dr. Lixing Sun, is a research professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Central Washington University. And while his research focuses on biology, his interests are in connecting behaviour, evolution, psychology and economics. In his latest book, The Liars of Nature and the Nature of Liars, Lixing explores how nature is rife with cheating, and perhaps surprisingly, how dishonesty has given rise to diversity. By exploring how everything from microscopic organisms to highly intelligent birds and mammals engage in lying and deception, he explains how cheating in nature relies on basic rules which also apply to humans. In his book and in our discussion, Lixing explains the prevalence of cheating in human society and identifies the kinds of cheating that spur innovation and cultural vitality, and lays down a blueprint for combating malicious cheating, such as fake news and disinformation. I think this is absolutely fascinating, and I think you will too. So let's dive into my discussion with Lixing Sun on lying. Lixing, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you so much, Christian, for your invitation. It should be fun to have a chat about that.
I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here because you've written a phenomenal book that, as I was saying to you before we started recording, was one of those ones I literally couldn't put it down. So I'm really excited that you're here. But before we come on to the book, can you just tell my listeners a little bit about yourself and your area of research?
Yeah, my area of research is in animal behavior in general and evolution, and especially in animal communication, sexual selection, mate competition, mate choice. In these areas, recently I've been venturing into behavioral economics, but using animal as models. And also I work on primates, so a lot of things. I'm more of a researcher on topics, testing hypotheses rather than studying one organism for life.
Love that. And, that brings us neatly onto the book, which is all about lying and cheating. What inspired you to look at that? Because on the face of it, that's it's an interesting topic to choose.
Yeah, in the beginning, I thought the idea is interesting, and I thought was simple. Turned out to be the idea is interesting, but it's not simple. It's complex. And as I investigated more into it, I found it was really complex and increasingly so, and especially when I consider our own societies.
And just to help us to think about that, you define in your book, you've got 2 rules of cheating. So it's probably a good idea just to cover those, and then we'll dive into a little bit. Can you just explain what those are?
That's one of the core questions I got into. The first is, during my research, I found lying and deceptions involve 2 very different biological mechanisms. So I realized that there are 2 different things. Lying is about the communication. You change the information, true information into falsehood. And that's lying. Sort of like the boy who cries wolf. That is lying. But deception is different. Deception is take advantage of others, these cognitive loopholes. We all have limitation in our cognitive ability, so that these loopholes could be taken advantages of by other species or individuals of the same species. So that is deception. It's very different from lying. So I put them together, call them cheat. But for the fun part of it, I both rule number 1 or rule number 2.
So you've summarized it there with those 2 things and saying that they're very different. But what really struck me in the book is you've got, and I haven't counted them all individually, but you obviously have, but it felt like hundreds of examples of both of these things happening in the natural world. And so my start point is, why is this stuff so prolific? Because you would think we're taught as children that lying and cheating is a bad thing. And yet, as you explain in the book, there's so much of this going on in nature.
Yeah, cheating is inevitable. It's a way of life. When communication is going on, when others have their limitations in their cognitive ability, you can take advantage of it. Not because of the existence of these advantages, cheating is inevitable. In other species, as well in our own species, it turned out to be, as I explored in the first chapter, they are everywhere, from small organisms for viruses to bacteria to plants and animals, just about everywhere.
The bit that astonished me was I had always thought of it as a sort of sideshow. And what really comes through in reading the book is that this is almost in the everyday procedures of many. There are certain species that the cuckoo would be a good example, where it really forms a core part of how they do things. But even in species where we might not think of it in those terms, this exists. Is the prevalence of this just as a result of it? I mean, you say it's a natural outcome. Is that why it's so common? I was just really surprised by, as I say, cuckoos, I expect, and I recognize that. But this is just so commonplace in species one might not think of as being cheaters.
Yeah, we normally don't think about their existence in some situations, but they are. Whenever, by definition, whenever a the force is communicated during lying, and lying takes place. Whenever one organism try to sneak away from another organism's sensory systems, that is deception. So if we look at it closely, and they shall be even more common, I think we will discover more. And pretty much in every channels, in the visual system, in our hearing, in our tasting, probably in other communication channels, such as electric communication, echolocation, all these things.
And so it's just to help listeners here a little bit, a simple example would be camouflage, right? Where you're pretending to be something else to protect yourself. And so that, using the way you've described it, that's a definition of deception. It's an understandable one because it makes sense, but that would be a good, that would be a sort of basic start point.
Yeah, camouflage and mimicry are both deceptions. Because say this is the picture of a katydid in South America, in the Amazons, try to mimic dead leaf. And every possible detail, try to hide away from their predators. And that was started by a young Englishman by the name of Henry Bates, a great English naturalist who spent 11 years in the Amazons. And he found that the mimicry was everywhere in butterflies. And so that name is called Batesian mimicry, and named after him.
I can see the attraction of going to study this. When you decided you were going to look at this, how did you go about exploring it? Because the more you dive in, it's such a broad topic. Were you looking thematically? How did you go and gather your evidence for this?
Yeah, in our study, we studied a small frog called a Pacific tree frog. In our area, very common. Now they are peeping around outside my house. But they are very common. They come in two morphs. One is totally green. The other one is motley gray. And people often see them as two different species. No, they are the same species, but just different morphs. And in our lab, we tested whether they could change color. And turned out to be they can. We put them under certain light conditions with different backgrounds. They do change color, but the ability to change is limited. They cannot switch between the two morphs, between the green or gray. For most of them, occasionally for some of them. So we call them the physiological change. So they can change over time, the shade and the pattern a little bit so as to better blend it into their background. So that's the way we measure. At that time, we used a fairly new technology using the Photoshop to measure how well they are blended into the background. So yeah, it is quantitatively measurable.
And so you've looked at something like that. And then what is it that takes you to broader thing? Because to draw your two rules, you've obviously looked across a range of different species. And there are as I say, tons of these in the book, tons of little examples of these things happening. How did you broaden that out? Are you just going out and looking for examples? What's the method for thinking about? I'm intrigued because studying one species is one thing, but thinking about how that jumps across, pun intended, with the frog. But how does that work?
Yeah, the ideas have been around for quite some time. It's just not in a way that I summarize them. And there are a few scientific papers written by well-known scientists, but they do not categorize the different ways of cheating in the way I do. I think that's simplest. That's fairly simple and straightforward. That either we have this cognitive limitation that allows organisms to fool us, which is deception, or either we tell lies, alter the communication, the honest language into falsehood, and tell lies, and that's lying. So that's the two ways of classifying into different patterns of cheating. Became to be obvious during my research. When I write the paper, basically, whoever writes the book, you basically synthesize the information and see what kind of patterns emerge.
And so the other question that people obviously have, and you address this in the book, but it's probably worth covering here, is this idea of when we think about lying and cheating, there's an element of intent there. Because we know that we're not telling the truth if we're lying, or if we're an accomplished liar, maybe we don't recognize it. We all intuitively understand that. How do we know in the animal kingdom that there's intent there that would go with that sense of lying or cheating?
That's the previous psychological definition. Cheating uses intention. In animals, it's difficult to show
because you can't ask them.
That intention is involved. That's the one weakness. So you can only define by behavior. And even in these mindless organisms, the viruses, the bacteria, you even cannot define their behavior. It's just that you see what they do, whether it is cooperative versus deceptive, all these things. So you cannot do that. And intention, actually, when intention is used in definition of cheating, actually is bad. The best of cheaters are not intentional. They just lie, they do these deceiving without knowing they are doing that. These are the best liars. They are unconscious. So with intention, it's a bad idea to sneak this intention in defining this is cheating, this is not. So then the best liars are unconscious.
Right, it's interesting, isn't it?
What they are doing, yeah.
Because we've sort of added that as an interpretation, and I think to your point, I was sort of reading and thinking, back if we look at it and say, well, of course they're going to do that, right? Because it makes sense for the propagation of the species and for other reasons. So naturally, intent is a sort of irrelevancy in the scheme of things, and I love that link across of saying, well, actually, if you take the ones where we do know, people's human beings. Actually, you're right. If you're really, really good at this stuff, it becomes second nature to you, and therefore becomes part of who you are. And so that thought process isn't there. So I love that particular piece. You talk about the fact that this is natural, this is going to happen. And one of the other things that surprised me is I had always done that human calculation of, oh, well, cheating and lying is bad. There's somebody wins and loses out of this. But you really point out that many of the developments and features of nature that we're used to come from that. And therefore, actually, back to intent being an interesting question, is it's actually beneficial to Mother Nature. It's actually a helpful feature. So far from being a bug, and pun intended, this is actually something that helps progression and evolution. And I wonder if you can just explain that, because that feels really counterintuitive to say that lying and cheating is a good thing. But actually, many of the attributes of nature and the planet that we're on come as a direct result of it.
Yeah, that's a real good question. In terms of non-human animals, we cannot place moral judgment on them. They just do what they do, whatever works, whatever would promote their fitness, which basically whatever will help them reproduce more, survive better, and that is beneficial. So they will do it. But in humans, cheating is not only a sort of instinctive issue in our behavior, but also it's a moral issue as well. So that comes to my classification of three kinds of cheatings. One is a pro-social, that you concern others, the well-being of others, and that kind of cheating is beneficial. You go to work and see your colleague, you say, hey, how good are you? You look very good, instead of you look sickly. And then you are in the better mood, you are honest, but definitely you will not be popular. You will not be popular. You hurt other people's feelings. And although you are telling the truth. So truth hurts sometimes. That these are the kind of arguing for the necessity of pro-social cheat. We cheat to convey our sincerity, our best wishes for others. So it's other concerning. So that's pro-social. And then anti-social is totally different than social. Anti-social is concerning for your own well-being or your own selfish reasons at the cost of others. So you hurt others while you benefit. And that is anti-social. And that is the part of cheating we should suppress, we should eliminate. It's not all cheating, all lying is bad. So that is I'm talking about. And there's a third level of cheating I call it the self-serving. And these are commercial advertisements. They exaggerate information a little bit, but not to a degree that to a total falsehood. So they actually deceive, but not lying. What I'm saying is, for example, you have a meat product in the market that is 95% fat-free. You do not say this product contains 5% fat. You would say this product contains 95% fat-free. Fat-free. So you try to look at the positive side. It's a deceiving process. Make consumers more likely to buy when you emphasize the positives, although the message is exactly the same. So these are the three kinds of cheating.
And that's a fascinating example of the read across that you make between, you explained it in the introduction, where you were talking about the moving into behavioral economics and behavioral science from natural science, I guess. And so that's a really good illustration. We can start to see that weave through of what you would call in behavioral science framing, where the presentation of information, you're pulling through that lens of cheating and lying. And people may feel that that's an exaggerated term, but you're right. The fundamentals are, I'm trying to present it to you in a particular way that doesn't give you the full picture. There's an alternative way of presenting it. But that's a good illustration, I think, of how you take the natural science through this lens of lying. I've never used that phrase before. It's interesting. Lens of lying into behavioral economics. That's the sort of gateway process that you're using when you think about these things.
Yeah, that's in the end, these all social sciences and natural sciences are connected. Many of the issues, you approach them in different ways. In natural science, you try to a general principle. In social sciences, you probably would approach it in a more specific way and emphasize language and culture a lot more. But in the end, we come together.
What astonished me was you move in the book from talking about animals to talking about humans. And I use that of course, that distinction's interesting because we are animals. And yet we think of ourselves as having a level of sophistication. And so I love the fact that you started out with the natural world and behaviors that, frankly, if humans were to replicate some of those things, and they do in many cases, but some of the things that we see in the animal kit, we go, that is totally unacceptable, disgraceful. And in fact, you start the book by anthropomorphizing animal behavior. And so we think we're reading about a human being. So you're talking about a mother, and you're actually talking about a bird. And there's that beautiful twist where we move from that thing. And I'm fascinated by this read across because I think we all understand the idea of, we've descended, loosely speaking, descended from the apes and all that sort of logic. But you're drawing all parallels of completely different species where I wouldn't have made that linkage. And are those links obvious, or is that something you have to look quite hard for?
Yeah, the link is obvious. There are no other, to my understanding, there are no other ways to promote this cheating. Basically, you have either lying or deceiving. So humans, although more complex, especially our language, which makes it more easy to do the cheating and lying, but they do not fall beyond these two rules. So that is the kind of basic principles we can follow, although the context is far more complex. The magnitude is more complex in our humans. So I think it's a better idea to talk about something more simple and then move on to add more and more complexity and nuances there. And so as to make a compelling argument. In a way, we use it to avoid the input anthropomorphism as much as possible. But nowadays, as we understand, especially in many situations, such as our connection with primates, anthropomorphism is not a bad thing. In many ways, because we share common ancestors, and not only in morphology, but also in behavior, even in cognitive abilities. So in these kind of situations, I don't think that anthropomorphism is that bad anymore. I think we have to avoid extreme, extreme anthropomorphism, but I think it's not wrong to be a little bit anthropomorphic.
And it's true. One of the things that the lenses, as I was rereading the book, because I sort of was, some of the stories really got me thinking. I was kind of musing to myself and thinking, you've got these two basic categorizations that sort of summarize the two different rules, if you like. But I sort of felt back, I thought, I wonder what we can learn from the animal kingdom about ways that we might be able to cheat and deceive and break rules. And it struck me as we were going through that there are lots of things, like camouflage is an obvious one. The military copies that. And we've seen lots of other examples of biomimicry in architecture or in the way that planes are designed. And I wondered, as you were looking at the study of sort of the animal kingdom before you got to people, were there things in there that you thought surprised you that might have? I'm not suggesting that we encourage people to do this, but I was intrigued. I thought because they're quite cunning, some of these tricks. And so, in the same way that we've learned things from camouflage being the obvious example, but I wondered, have we got some way to go? Are they better at this than us?
Yeah, it's just a wonderful question. It got me to think a lot more beyond that. I mean, cheating is inevitable, whether we acknowledge it or not. So we have to deal with it. It's a reality. But the one thing that I found that we can learn from animal, I mean, from cheating point of view, but people have been doing that. The cheaters have been doing that, is to be innovative in their tactics, in their strategy, stay ahead of other people's detection. And that is working for some animals as well. They always invent something new. But of course, it's a slower process in other animals. In us, it could be quick. We have one scam today, tomorrow could be another one. So we can avoid the one kind of scam. It's harder for us to avoid, at least in the beginning, to avoid the new kinds of scams in town or online. So that is always it's a perennial fight between cheating and anti-cheating tactics. And in that case, I think I propose some kind of ideas, but I think normally the cheaters are so innovative, they are ahead of the curve. They're one step ahead of us.
And flipping to the good side, if you like, so if we've got this issue of cheating that we have to deal with, the bit I thought was really interesting was you start to say, look, it's going to happen. And I think lots of attempts that we have in the human world, it makes a presumption that we've designed, that we can design perfect controls. That, of course, if we can just train people in the right way, they won't do the wrong thing. In other words, we can have 100% compliance, 100% ethics and morality. And so if we take that starting principle of it is going to happen, and whatever rules and parameters and controls we put in place, humans are going to try and, just as animals do, humans are going to try and find their ways around that. It becomes a game, if you like. It struck me that was a really helpful lesson, that we should just start from the presumption of this stuff is going to happen. So let's work with that. Let's not delude ourselves that it's impossible. And I love this idea of just getting ahead of the curve and thinking like cheaters. And so if I look at some of the things you talk about in the animal kingdom, that's kind of what's going on, is that there is this natural understanding that there's a battle ongoing. And of course, species get fooled for a period, or parts of species, tribes get fooled for a period of time, and then they get wise to it and then they move on. And so I love this idea of it's an ongoing battle and we should think of it in those terms. And so some of the things I took from your piece is if you're on the good side, right, if you're trying to stop cheating and lying, then recognize it's a never ending thing. And you're dealing with sentient beings that are going to be cunning and adapt. And so you've got to kind of get ahead of that. So I thought there was a really powerful lesson there for the authorities, whether they be moral or legal or compliance or whatever, to start thinking about this topic.
Yeah, that's you have said it so eloquent. But I would like to add a little bit. Over so many years in our history, we've been trying to eliminate the bull cheating, or try to be as honest as possible, 100%. That is a wrong-headed approach. As you just said, summarized, that the world cheating is a game that's ongoing. We continue to fight. It did not disappear in the past. It is not disappearing today. It will not disappear tomorrow. So we have to live with it. And what I would suggest is that we limit our fight as to what kind of cheating we should permit. Only the antisocial cheating we should eliminate. We try to limit them as much as possible to the smallest, to the least hurtful situation as possible. But allowing these pro-social cheating going, allow the self-serving cheating, such as commercial advertisements to exist. And they are neutral, pretty much. They are either telling us information or at the same time, they may get some money from us. All these things. So this self-serving cheating is more into the gray area. We have been living with them all the time, and we hesitantly permit their existence and the business and these people on promote their products through that way. So I think that is in the gray area as to what degree they should be allowed to deceive us. But the antisocial cheating, we must eliminate. We may not be able to completely eliminate that, but we can actually put all the forces, all the measures to limit the hurtful results.
And it's interesting when you talk in those terms, because one of the things that I was reflecting on as I was reading the book and sort of thinking about applications of the world that I understand, as well as I now watch it. And I should add, I watch animals really closely now. The small child in me is now walking around. And historically, I would always look at people. And now I'm watching. And of course, there are certain species that's easier to observe, but dogs, for example, and how they interact with their owners. So I wanted to thank you and also say, you're exhausting me because I'm on the lookout for this stuff now wherever I go to see what are they up to. It's another species for me to observe. But the bit I found fascinating was the structures that we've put in place. And if I think about politics as a good example, we can I'll pick the UK so you don't have to make any comments about US politics unless you want to. If I look at someone like Boris Johnson, who is clearly a known liar and has lied in all sorts of different ways, he's probably covered every single base that you've covered, all of the ones you've looked at. The system that we had wasn't designed for that sort of behavior. And so what we've got here is somebody breaking molds, and we can think of other examples, breaking molds of system. We have norms that we have evolved. And so it really struck me that in many respects, they're doing what we see out in Mother Nature of breaking species, have designed. And when we talk about species, I should add, you also include things like trees. And so it's not just animals, it's the natural world and how they interact. So the lesson for me, and I'd love your comments on this, was that we've designed, we kind of think we've got it nailed. We've designed the perfect political system, maybe the perfect educational system. And actually, we should go back to your point around nature. We should recognize that we need to evolve that. And so we will get people, if we just stick with static systems for long periods of time, we'll get people that are wise to that and find ways around it. And that's just replicating the dynamics that you talk about in the natural world.
Yeah, that's we have worse cheaters than you do.
Well, we can feel free to go there. I just didn't want to drag you to there, but feel free.
Yeah, to me, Boris Johnson is more reasonable than some of our politicians, as long as there are some benefits, politically or economically. And it's difficult to eliminate the incentives behind these cheating. So the politicians always do. The reason being that the more I think about it, the more I come to the realization that, well, if they don't do that, how can they be a politician? How can they survive that area? A profession that has the least reputation among all the voters. So it's cultural ecosystem that nurtures that kind of cheating behavior, tending not to tell truth, while leaving truth for historians to dig up in the future. But that's always the case. To us, ordinary citizens, it's always better for politicians to tell truth, but they don't, because they care about immediate survival, but we care about, let us know what is going on. So that is the kind of interest mismatch. It's difficult to politicians from.
But that's interesting,
And
because
sometimes,
I mean, if I look back to the natural science studies that you start the book with, I mean, that's very much the dynamic there, right? It's short-term thinking in many cases because the species aren't around for that long, so they have to think in short term. But you point to the classic things, right? It's how do I stay alive and how do I procreate? Two key demands that are on there. And so they're thinking very short term. So as I think the reason that I made that read across to politics is probably exactly the point you're making, is that politics is, I mean, we want it to be a long-term game. We want them to be thinking, but of course they're thinking in electoral cycles, which are, even if that's several years, that's relatively short. And you can do a lot of, as we've seen, you can cause a lot of harm in a short period of time. But that's the interesting thing, is that I guess that the closer we get to short-term thinking in the human, or if the more we incentivize short-term thinking in the human world, the more naturally we're going to be pointing towards some of these examples that you've pulled out from the natural world.
Yeah, it's natural order driven by natural selection, but the organisms have to live for the moment, moment by moment. In politics, the politicians have to survive the election cycle. And that is the Congress in the United States is 2-year election cycle, and the Senate is 6-year election cycle. So the Senate is more stable than the House of the Representatives. I'm not sure about UK the UK election system. How often the term limit is for the Parliament?
Well, it used to be fixed. It's about I think it's 5 years they have to
5 years. It's better sometimes, because especially for U.S. House of Representatives, it's a 2-year cycle. So pretty much from the moment you're elected, you have to fight for your next election. So that is not easy. I understand. So that drives them to the extremely short-term vision. That is, they survive the next election in 2 years. I mean, that is the system problem or system-driven problem that making them extremely short-sighted. Just immediate result. So that is that is difficult to solve.
Which if the founding fathers, I presume they came up with this, though, but whoever came up with it, if they'd read your book, right, you'd start to make those links, because you basically what you're pointing to, there's a really good close linkage to animals that are surviving day to day or hour by hour in many cases, or minute by minute maybe. So that's shorter term incentives. So we can start to see, I think there's some really interesting parallels here. We can start to recognize that there's a really obvious read across. If I need to feed myself every day or procreate as frequently as I possibly can, I'm going to find clever ways to make that happen. Ditto if I need to be relaxed. And so I think for me, that's where that really interesting read across comes in that thinking. I want to pull another example that I've always found fascinating, is you talk about peacocks and other species that do things that seem ridiculous. So peacock feathers. And with my behavioral science or economics hat on, I know that that's a costly signaling device. So a peacock, because those feathers that they have, they're not convenient. They're a pain in the neck and they make you extremely vulnerable. And so that's a good example, I think, of something you dissect there, where you say, this looks really silly from an evolutionary perspective, but it's super smart. And of course, the read across then into the human world is people who do things that are ostentatious, that serve no evolutionary purpose because they're demonstrating that they can. And I thought that for me was a really, really good example of counter. It doesn't seem like it's a very smart thing to do in the, neither strategy seems particularly smart. Then why waste money on this thing? Why waste time and effort on pointless things? But you unpick that and say there's value in that.
Yeah, that is that the costly signal is a wonderful idea. It's an evolutionary idea from the 1970s, but now it's used everywhere. And the costly signal is a way of preventing cheating. When a signal is costly to produce, it itself is a lie detector. You cannot cheat easily. You have to pick where your money is. So that's a wonderful idea. And the problem of many of our cheating is the cost is too little. If you back it up by costly a signal, and it will at least limit the capacity you can cheat in animals, in humans as well. And the politicians in the United States, they swear to be truthful to the Constitution. They put their hand on the Bible to make the swear of that. But that has no real cost, right? If they can do that, they can even swear on the stack of Bibles with no cost, right? They needed to show that there is a cost. For example, even the Japanese underground called the Yakuza, if somebody did something wrong or double cross the underground organization, they got their pinkies. And that is a real cost. Our politicians don't have any cost for that. So I think if we can implement some kind of cost system into what politicians would swear to do, that would make a difference. That would make a difference.
And I love that because I was thinking about that in a totally different context, but similar dynamics. If we think about bankers, investment bankers and traders, right, who are basically trading with the bank's money. And so the personal reward's massive, the personal costs very, very, your worst case is you'll lose your job historically. You might now start to go to jail. And so that's an interesting one. So the read across there, if I've got this right, would be to say in the natural world, right, we expect people to have a lot at stake. If you are a high quality individual, you want to make yourself attractive to mates, you have to do things that come at a high personal cost to you, and you demonstrate your quality by the fact that you can do that. Then the read across in the human world, back to this point that you've got to with the Bible, was if we were saying for bankers, well, actually, maybe you have to put your house on the line before you're allowed to gamble with the bank's money. That would be a good illustration. And so actually, that would be not just a mechanism for controlling them, but that might also be a way of rehabilitating the industry, because you'd be saying, actually, these people they've got to have skin in the game to be able to do this. And so there's an example of something, taking a peacock, we can start to think about lessons that we can learn in the human world about incentives and drivers and those sorts of things. And that's why I think, one, it's fascinating to know what's going on in the natural world around us, but that sort of read across, which isn't immediately obvious when I look at a peacock with his plumage and sort of go, that's beautiful, that seems a bit sick. But you've rightly in your analysis there, though, you've taken us over to swearing on the Bible, and I've taken us over to bankers and putting their house on. That for me is the really interesting read across here, is we can really start to think creatively, back to sort of being creative at people to stop people lying, but we can think creative about how we design structures, processes, and incentives in the human world based on some of these dynamics that we can recognize in the natural world.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point, and a very practical as well. And it has happened several times. I remember the old time when a person is in debt, that person would go to the jail. If he could not pay back the money, his children will do that. But that is a better thing. I mean, it's one person's responsibility. It could have a long-term effect, even cross-generation. That was damaging to the economy. Only China still has something like that. That's still going, but not anymore in most Western countries. So I think that's an asymmetry of the risk-taking as to the consequence. And that is, I have some examples. For example, this Bernie Madoff guy, you know this guy, right?
Oh, yeah.
16 billion Ponzi scheme. Lasting people, 16 billion. But he only got, how many years in jail? Even in jail. And lots of these monkey business would pass without being detected. And there are other situations. Volkswagen, in the 2016, they had this cheating device called a defeat device, which basically cheated the carbon emission, and turned out to be the person who came up with the idea got very little punishment, while the company was punished by 7.4 billion fine. And then the stock market value lost 80 billion in European stock market, in Europe alone, because it's listed in multiple areas in the United States, in Asia as well. But in Europe alone, it lost $80 billion for the company. So individual responsibility is not shared, or is shared. The consequence is shared with the company, while the punishment is not shared. The punishment is shared with the company, while the profit is not. So these people who get the money, either they move on or they retire. from these positions. So it's the asymmetry of benefit versus cost ratio that would motivate these people come up with these egregious cheating schemes. There's another example of one of the largest U.S. banks called Wells Fargo. I think the fourth largest banks in the United States. And it's a former CEO by the name of John Stunt. He concocted a sort of like millions of these non-existing tasks so as to beef up his performance as CEO. It turned out to be that led to the Wells Fargo to $2.7 billion fine by the U.S. government for the cheating. But he did not suffer any. You see that he was only removed from the CEO position. And if you could claw back the money he had made, that would be difference. So I think a little bit of more of these responsibility for these, especially those in the leadership positions. A little bit more responsibility that will occur. Lots of cheating. We got through this real estate slightly over 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And that was the bank deception was widespread because of little cost to the bankers. Well, by the way, only the Iceland got all these banks in jail.
Right.
Only Iceland.
The thing that fascinates me with all of this is that, to come back to the lessons from nature and thinking that read across. I mean, in many respects, right, the way, if we look at the most egregious example, and these are, the species is large enough probably to sustain this, but if we look at these things, this is the sort of behavior that I'm guessing evolution would work out of other species. Because you'd look at it and say, that's not a sustainable basis on which to continue. So we ought to adapt to recognize we don't want that. And yet our cycle of evolution, I mean, it seems to me quite glacial. If I look back to the banking crisis, yes, some changes were made, but the fundamentals haven't really changed. And in many respects, the core problem of, as you say, having skin in the game, incentives, the level of personal accountability as opposed to corporate, the veil of incorporation offers. And so when we look at all of those things, we're not reacting in the way that I sense the natural world does when I read those parts of your books, is that they adapt because these behaviors don't help the species.
Yeah, in nature, but I wouldn't say species, individuals who do cheating, individuals who do cheating. But in nature, there's an idea called, in evolution, called frequency dependent. If in a population that is completely honest, and that population is vulnerable to cheaters, because cheaters can get all the benefit because everybody believes it's true. Whatever somebody says, does something, it's true. So these small number of individuals could take advantage of that. So they will do better than average. But so now you see more individuals who will do cheating as well, and turn out to be that will cut down the profit margin of cheating. So that would automatically adjust the number of individuals who do cheating all the time. So that's the kind of natural situation. For example, if you in a population, that population only 2% of individuals can live on cheating, and that's just 2%. If you have 3%, that 1% will be cut. And if you have 99% that honest, 1% of cheating, and you have more individuals to join the kind of strategy to use cheating to make a living. So that's the kind of dynamics it is. But in natural populations, it swings like that. But in us, it's different. We have new culture, which means new opportunity, new technology, internet, for example, new opportunities to do something dishonest. But that's all the time. We often learn hard lessons, such as the banking system virtually failed 15 years ago. Well, we learned from some hard lessons, but the new ones keep coming. So we will still to move on. And that kind of arms race will never end.
Wow.
So it will gradually evolve and to be different, to adjust. So we learn all the lessons, but there will be still new games to fight.
One of the things that fascinates me about the way you talk is the enthusiasm for the subject, right? The passion for it. You're very uplifting and engaging, and clearly this excites and interests you. And I wondered, the more you study this cheating and lying, there is a world where I could see somebody who spends all their time looking at that turning into a very cynical individual who fears for the future of humanity. I don't get a negative sense from you. And I wondered, how has your research and writing the book impacted your personal perspective on lying? Are you just more aware of the techniques that are there? How do you feel about the future of mankind? What's it done to your perspective on the world?
Yeah, it's an ongoing game. It's like a predator and prey predation, or parasites and hosts. It's an ongoing game. Nobody wins, but the game transcends over time. So there's no reason to feel pessimistic. I just move on, and you have new tricks, and we have. And for most of us, the good thing is, well, cheating is a minority strategy. The vast number of people are mainly honest, and they would not do things hurt themselves. So this is a good thing, but we still have to deal with the small minority number of cheaters who live on other people's expenses. So yeah, that kind of system will never go away. So it's naturally existing. It will continue to exist. And we just get ready to fight them. So it becomes part of life. Sort of like fighting diseases. It's basically the same thing.
And yeah, I love that. I love that way of looking at the world. Very super
Sure.
positive. We need that at the moment. And do you think your ability to detect lying and cheating has that increased as a result of your research, or is it because it's an evolving thing you can't get better at it? How's your personal sort of view on that?
Yeah, I have many self revelations, many self revelations. Yeah, I have become increasingly more sensitive, more alert about the scams going on. And then at the same time, I realized my personal ability to detect these antisocial cheating scams is limited, just like every one of us. And especially when people are older, for example, 70 years, 80 years, their cognitive systems decline. So that will make them even more vulnerable to scams, especially new scams. So these older folks are most vulnerable. And these scammers normally, overwhelmingly target these older folks. They have resources, they have assets accumulated over their life career, and they are easier to fool, to cheat. So that's the group that need particular protection. So I think it's not just a personal issue, it's also a society issue as well. How social organizations, NGOs, or government can help us to fight against. And a personal fight, yeah, is limited. It's a first line of defense, but our ability, each and every one of us, is limited. We needed the kind of societal support in terms of fighting these antisocial cheating, preventing us from falling into victims.
And I'll ask the question on the other side of the fence. And I'm not suggesting that you have become this awful amoral cheater or liar, but I wondered whether, given that we all lie on some occasions, I wondered whether has your skill set improved? Are you more? I don't know. Just it sort of struck me that if you're spending your time looking at this subject and writing about it, you'll have a greater awareness of it. How has that impacted you in that way? And as I stress, I'm not suggesting that you've kind of gone full on, but do you see what I'm saying? It's like it must impact you on some level.
Yes, sometimes I give compliments to other people. I tell myself I'm lying. It's not easy every day. You think about it, you are lying. But I use this word lying because I categorize them into three different kinds. If you are other concerning, and lying is not a better word. So I'm using this word more neutrally, in a neutral sense. It could refer to the pro-social cheating, or could refer to antisocial cheating. But I try to stay away from anything possible to fall my the lying, the pro-social lying, to be not antisocial, not selfish. So even I don't often, I use it to be more likely to promote myself. Then I realized that is a little bit of gray area. It's not pro-social. So I actually try to shut up more often nowadays, not to talk about myself, but I'm fairly generous in giving compliments to other people.
We could easily make an argument that says your research is incredibly important, right? You're helping people to understand the basis of lying. And so promoting your research using some of those techniques, you could make an argument is pro-social. And so I think it's really interesting when you talk in those terms, is recognizing that actually the temptation to do this on some level is there for all of us all of the time. The other bit that I took from the book was that I think when we think about telling lies, it tends to be in our memory and in the stories that we tell ourselves, it always sticks there as isolated incidents. But actually, it doesn't work like that. With this idea of deception and perception of the world, it's an ongoing challenge. And I thought the read across the natural world where they're having to be alive to stay alive all of the time, there's some interesting read across there for us. This is not a periodic thing. This is there in every decision and every moment. When we talk about lies and dishonesty, it's always individual decisions or moments that come to mind. But actually, it's a pervasive thing in the way that we think.
Yeah, that's if you record your own conversation during a cocktail party, for example, and then you carry it around and then listen to what you have said in the recording, and you see how many of them are true. So they are always blended with truth. I think in terms of those untruthful statements, as long as they do not hurt other people, I think it should be permitted. And lots of humor, lots of fun. Basically, creating is to create something that's unrealistic. So really, right? The fantasies, for example, the world, the video games, these are all falsehood. They're all falsehood. But they are part of our life. The movies, the novels, for example, the literary creations, the artistic creations, these are all falsehood. Think about this. It's just a part of our life. So we live it, we enjoy it. And nowadays, we even indulge in it. Self-pride, for example. And that is something that I have not talked about. It's so hard to live without self-esteem. And often we are overdoing it. It's one of the most difficult things to realize our own weaknesses. It's the most difficult thing because we are often indulged in these self-deception.
I love that. Wow. But that sort of makes the point, right, about this being an ongoing thing, is that every statement that we make, there is the risk of us tipping into that territory.
Yeah, I actually wrote a small essay after the book was published a few months ago. I wrote a small essay in Psychology Today. I said how we can outsmart ourselves. But basically, my point is that we have to realize our own weaknesses. That is very difficult to realize because we are more or less overestimating ourselves, basically deceiving ourselves. For me, in my writing experience, I began to write in the beginning or late 1990s. And after my first book, which is about the beaver, published, I thought I could write myself. The beaver was co-authored with my advisor. So I thought I could write by myself. For the next 50 years, I got rejections one after another all the time. When I showed my writing to friends and colleagues, they all said, "That's great. That's great." Turned out to be, they were complimenting. They did not want to criticize me. So I was indulged in my own self-deception for 15 years without producing any successful books. For 15 years, I wasted 15 years before I realized, oh gosh, everything was wrong. This was not good. This was terrible. Until that moment, I began to learn English in a different way because my native language is not English. So I took all the courses in writing in the English department. And after that, I found myself at a different level. So I realized I had wasted 15 years by having the good feeling about myself, which was totally, totally wrong. So I think that kind of feeling is shared by many people. So if I have any advice to share with other people, it's very hard to realize our own weaknesses. If we can do that, you will be great.
Okay, now this is going to sound like I'm speaking like your friends, but I'm going to turn those 15 years into an investment. All right, and an investment that because I think, as with all things in life, you have to have gone through the journey that you've gone through to get to where you've got to. And who knows, you may have got there otherwise, but this is the one you've chosen. And I have to say, Lixing, I'm delighted that you went on that journey, because the book that you've written is just fantastic. I loved it. And as people will have detected on the show, sometimes I just have guests on where I'm really excited to speak to them because the subject's interesting, but I know they're going to be interesting. And the tone of voice that you had in the book, the way you approached it, the playful nature of it, you could have written a really boring book based on the same subject matter, but you chose to write a really exciting, engaging one. So I want to say, I know it must have been difficult to look back, but I'm glad you invested those 15 years in getting to where you've got to now.
Yeah. The way when I came down to working on this book, I was telling myself I needed to do three things for my readers. One is to inform, tell them what is new, what is interesting. The second one is to enjoy, to make them happy, enjoyable to read. So I went out of my way to rather than just telling this is science principle, this scientific principle, this scientific discovery, I just want to entertain and having fun. And the most important of all is to enlighten, and which also means you get message from there, and how my book, you can get information from my book so as to be beneficial for your life. So that is my three words: inform, entertain, and then enlighten. I try to avoid educate because people are all smart. I mean, they learn their own ways. Although we are different, but people are all smart. They can see it.
But well, if you told me as a kid growing up that I'd be reading a science book at this age and enjoying it as much as I have, I would not have believed you. So I thank you for reinvigorating my interest in science. It's a fabulous read. I cannot recommend it enough. I really enjoyed it. And the bit that I loved is I started reading it and I was fascinated by the nature pieces and the animals and the crazy things that they do. But the fact that you then flip it into the human species, and you rightly say, I can't talk about this dynamic without talking to people, I think makes it doubly valuable. And certainly for listeners on this show, that's, you get to some really fascinating behavioral insights and some tips for how we can manage this. So it's not just presenting a problem, it's also your thoughts on how we can manage. So Lixing, I want to say thank you for writing an incredible book. I loved it, but thank you even more right now for a brilliant conversation on the show. You've been an absolute pleasure as a guest. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Christian, for your invitation, for a wonderful conversation. Stay tuned. I'm working on next project.
Fantastic. Do you want to give us a little sneak? What's the next one going to be on?
It's about sexual selection, the evolutionary aspects of sex diversity, gender diversity, and I try to use the same similar approach, informative, entertaining, as well as enlightening.
Fascinating. Well, consider yourself to have an invite to come back on the show when that book is out. But in the meantime, people can digest the current one, which is a fabulous read. Lixing, thank you for writing a great book and thank you for being an amazing guest on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christian.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to Lixing for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Lixing, his book, The Liars of Nature and the Nature of Liars, and the research and the articles that he mentioned, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the show, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes of the show that you've missed, visit the show's website at humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show. But in the meantime, stay safe. Remember that if you are going to lie and cheat, at least do it in a pro-social manner. And thank you so much for listening.